air in the Langley parking garage was sterile and cold, a layered scent of cured concrete, ozone from the fluorescent lights, and the lingering ghost of exhaust fumes. A low, constant hum from the ventilation system vibrated in the floor, a pressure in the ears more than an actual noise. Ryan Callahan sat in the driver's seat of his unremarkable sedan, the engine off, the silence inside the car a stark contrast to the deep drone of the garage. He did not check his watch. He did not need to. Punctuality was a component of the system, as predictable as gravity. A black government sedan with tinted windows pulled into the adjacent spot, its tires making no sound on the smooth floor. The engine cut out, and the passenger door opened. A man named Hughes slid into the seat beside Callahan. Hughes was ageless, his face a bland mask that betrayed no specific year between 35 and 55. He wore a perfectly tailored but inexpensive suit, the uniform of a man whose authority did not come from a brand name. His hands, resting on his knees, were scrubbed clean, the nails perfectly trimmed. He did not offer a greeting. He simply existed in the space, a functional part of the briefing process. "Upper Peninsula, Michigan," Hughes said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He placed a thick khaki file on the dashboard. A geological survey team went missing. Officially, they're lost, storms moving in. Unofficially, their final transmission was panicked. Mentioned impossibly fast wolves. Callahan said nothing, his eyes on the file. His own hands remained steady on the wheel. He knew this part of the ritual. The slow, deliberate feeding of information, each piece a measured dose. Hughes elaborated, his words precise, building the framework of the operation. "Your cover is a freelance biologist, contracted by United States Fish and Wildlife. You're studying black bear migration patterns after an anomalously warm autumn. All your credentials are in order. The local ranger has been advised of your presence, but not your purpose." Hughes paused, letting the weight of the next word settle. The pause itself was a tool, designed to focus the mind. No contact, no witnesses, full autonomy. Callahan picked up the file. The cardboard was cool to the touch. Inside, the contents were organized with surgical neatness. Topographical maps marked with the last known coordinates of the camp. Biographies of the geologists, all former military, not men prone to panic. A technical report on the garbled transmission, with a waveform analysis that showed elevated heart rates and stress markers in the speaker's voice. And at the back, a single print from a trail camera. Callahan pulled a small magnifier from his jacket pocket and leaned in. The image was grainy, distorted by low light and motion blur. In the foreground, a deer looked back, its eyes wide with terror. But it was the shape in the background that held his attention. A silhouette, half hidden by a pine tree. It was not just large, its proportions were fundamentally wrong for any known predator. The limbs were too long, the chest cavity too deep and powerful, the neck thick and poised at an unnatural angle. It defied mammalian anatomy. Its form was brutally efficient, a body built for one purpose: the hunt. The blurred form was a trigger. Callahan's fingers brushed the thin, white scar above his right eyebrow. For a fraction of a second, the smell of concrete vanished, replaced by the scent of pine and gunpowder. The memory was a clean, sharp shard of glass in his mind. Screams on a crackling radio, the chaos of a failed operation in the mountains of Idaho, and the face of his superior officer, lying with perfect composure during the after-action review. His jaw tightened, a small knot of muscle clenching just below his ear. They had followed the protocol then, too. And people had died because the protocol was rigid and the world was not. Hughes saw the minute shift in his posture, but remained silent. The silence was its own form of communication, an acknowledgement of why Callahan was the one sitting here. He was here because he had nothing left to lose and because he knew how to keep quiet. He was a reliable component in an unreliable world. He did not ask questions. He did not have attachments. He was a tool sharpened by loss. Callahan closed the file, the crisp sound echoing in the car. Timeline? It was his first and only question. Confirmation within 48 hours. Neutralization is situational. Extraction on your signal. Comms are via satellite encryptor. Windows at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Hughes's gaze was steady. Miss 2 consecutive check-ins and we initiate the lost asset protocol. It was a sterile euphemism for being written off. His existence would be scrubbed, his file sealed, his life and death absorbed by the silence. He would become a ghost, not even a memory. Hughes opened his door. Good luck, Ryan. He did not wait for a reply. The government sedan started and pulled away as silently as it had arrived. Callahan started his engine. His face was a mask of cold professionalism. This was not a hunt. It was not revenge. It was a job. A complex technical problem that needed to be solved. And he was the solution. The armory was a small, soundproofed room in the basement of Callahan's unassuming suburban house. Concrete walls, bare except for pegboard holding specialized tools. Under the glare of a single, bright workbench lamp, the components of his loadout were laid out in a display of surgical precision. This was his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world was reduced to ordered, reliable systems. The smell of gun oil and metal was clean, uncomplicated. He began with his primary weapon, a Scar H carbine. He stripped it down to its basic components, the metallic clicks of pins being pushed and parts being separated the only sounds in the room. Each piece, the bolt carrier, the firing pin, the gas piston, was laid out on a clean, oil-resistant mat. He wiped every surface with a dry cloth, then a solvent-soaked one, checking for microscopic signs of wear, hairline, fractures, or carbon buildup. He then applied a thin, precise layer of lubricant to the bolt carrier group and rails. The choice of weapon was deliberate. He needed guaranteed penetration and stopping power against a large, fast-moving target at range. The carbine was chambered for a heavy, powerful round. It was a rifle that broke things. He reassembled the rifle with practiced economy of motion, the pieces fitting together with a satisfying finality. He mounted the holographic sight with its magnifier, then attached a thermal clip-on to the rail in front of it. He checked the alignment, making minute adjustments, his focus absolute. He racked the charging handle. The sound was solid, authoritative. Next came the ammunition. He loaded the magazines by hand, each round inspected before being pressed into place. The brass casings were polished, the primers seated perfectly. These were not standard military ball ammunition. They were heavy, expansive rounds designed for big-game hunting. Each bullet was engineered for maximum energy transfer and catastrophic tissue damage. They were designed to ensure that what was hit stayed down. A professional did not create a wounded, enraged target that could still fight. He clicked each magazine into the rifle's lower receiver, checking for a secure fit, then set them aside in a neat row. His sidearm, a heavy-caliber Glock, lay waiting. It was a beast of a pistol, a heavy-caliber handgun nicknamed the Bear Stopper for a reason. Its polymer frame felt stark and functional in his hand. He loaded its magazines with hard-cast lead bullets, solid projectiles designed to punch through thick bone and dense muscle mass. The pistol was his last line of defense, a tool for a fight that had gone horribly, intimately wrong. It was the weapon for when the plan had failed. He packed his backpack with the same meticulous care. Each item had its place in a designated pouch. 5 days' worth of freeze-dried meals, high in calories, low in taste. A water filter. An expanded individual first aid kit containing combat application tourniquets, hemostatic agents, and 2 powerful syrettes of military-grade analgesic. He checked his ballistic helmet and his lightweight plate carrier. The ceramic plates were rated for rifle rounds, a heavy, uncomfortable assurance. He was not expecting a firefight, but the system demanded preparation for the worst-case scenario. It was about mitigating variables. The technology was last. He powered on his ruggedized laptop, uploading the topographical data and satellite imagery from the file. He tested the portable seismic sensors, small innocuous spikes he would drive into the ground. They would detect vibrations and relay the information to his laptop, creating a virtual perimeter. He checked the charge on the miniature, motion-activated infrared cameras. Information was ammunition. The more he knew, the fewer bullets he would need. Finally, he donned the gear. The plate carrier settled over his shoulders, the pack buckled tight against his back. The weight was familiar, a strange kind of comfort. He shifted his weight, listening. Silence. Nothing rattled, nothing chafed. He was a streamlined system of lethality. He caught his reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. It was not a man looking back at him. It was an operative. A function. The solution to a problem. He was ready. He left his sedan at the designated pull-off on the edge of the Ottawa National Forest, the keys tucked under the driver's side floor mat, as instructed. The asphalt felt strangely final beneath his boots. An anonymous pickup truck with a drab, empty camper shell waited for him, its key in the gas cap. The truck was dusty, unremarkable, chosen to blend in with the local vehicles. He transferred his gear from the car to the truck, the silence of the deep woods already pressing in. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. He took one last look back at the paved road, a final glimpse of civilization, before climbing into the truck and heading down the barely there logging trail that led into the wilderness. The forest greeted him with an unnerving quiet and the rich, damp smell of decaying autumn leaves. The colors were a brilliant, fiery palette of red and gold, but the air held a distinct chill, a promise of the coming winter. The sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy of pine and maple, casting the trail in a gloomy twilight. The trail worsened, the truck's suspension groaning as it navigated deep ruts and fallen branches. His cell phone had lost its signal miles ago. The truck's radio hissed with static. The sense of isolation grew with every yard he traveled. This was a place where things disappeared without a trace. He found the camp just before dusk. It was situated in a small, damp hollow tucked beside a creek. The first thing that struck him was the unnatural violence of the scene. This was not the work of a bear foraging for food. This was an act of focused, explosive rage. Tents were shredded, ripped open from the inside, the fabric destroyed by occupants who had been desperately trying to claw their way out. Expensive global positioning system units and geological survey equipment were smashed into fragments, their plastic casings shattered, their delicate electronics exposed to the elements. A heavy-duty cooler was ripped open, its contents strewn across the ground, untouched. This was not about hunger. Callahan began a methodical sweep, moving in a slow, expanding spiral from the center of the camp. His training took over, his mind cataloging details, building a picture of the event. He noted the deep, parallel gouges on the heavy-duty metal footlockers, scratches made by something with incredible strength and claws like tempered steel. The field kitchen was overturned, but strangely, there was very little blood. A few spatters on a tent flap, a smear on a sleeping bag, but not the carnage of a predatory attack. This meant the bodies were removed. He found the crucial evidence near the overturned stove, something others would have missed. A cluster of shell casings, glinting in the fading light. The geologist had fought back. His eyes scanned the ground around the casings, his gaze low and patient. There in the soft earth was a deep furrow, and nestled within it was a piece of a claw. It had broken off in the struggle. Callahan carefully retrieved it with tweezers and sealed it in an evidence bag. It was thick, black, and crescent-shaped, more like something from a prehistoric reptile than any mammal he knew. The edge was wickedly sharp. Down by the small creek that bordered the camp, he found what he was looking for. In the damp mud, a clear set of tracks. At first, they were the prints of 4 massive paws, like a grizzly's but with longer, more defined digits. But a few yards on, the pattern changed. The creature had risen up. The tracks were now bipedal, disturbingly similar to a human's, but with an elongated heel and the clear, deep impression of claws at the end of each toe. He pulled out a small tape measure. The stride length was nearly 7 feet. The data clicked into place, aligning with the worst of the agency's theoretical files. Violent, intelligent, territorial. He sat on a fallen log, the pieces of the puzzle locking together in his mind. There was more than one. They attacked at night, with overwhelming speed and violence. They neutralized the armed geologists and dragged the bodies away. This was not about feeding on sight. It was about something else, something more deliberate. He was dealing with an intelligent, organized, and brutally efficient adversary. The cold of the evening seeped into him, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Staying in the desecrated camp was a tactical impossibility. It was a kill zone, a baited field. They would come back. Callahan consulted his map, the paper crinkling in the quiet air. He cross-referenced it with the terrain before him, his eyes scanning the landscape with a practiced, analytical gaze. A quarter-mile to the north, a low, pine-covered rocky ridge offered a strategic advantage. It provided a clear overwatch position on the hollow where the camp lay, with only one easily defensible approach from the rear. It would be his observation post, his nest. He spent the remainder of the daylight establishing his web. He was not setting explosive tripwires. They were too loud, too overt, and this enemy was clearly not a mindless beast. His weapon was information. He moved in a wide circle around his chosen position, driving the small seismic sensors into the earth at intervals of 50 to 70 yards. Each spike, disguised to look like a piece of rock or a knot of wood, was a silent sentinel. He placed them along game trails and natural funnels in the terrain, anticipating the enemy's most likely avenues of approach. Next, he established his visual surveillance. He scaled 2 towering pines and a thick oak, his movements quick and sure-footed. He placed 3 miniature infrared cameras at key vantage points, securing them with nylon straps. One camera watched the ravaged camp itself, a silent eye on the scene of the crime. A second monitored the narrow trail leading up to his ridge, his only potential blind spot. The third covered a wide, open glade to the west, an area that felt unnaturally exposed. He linked all the devices to his laptop via a secure, short-range wireless channel. The laptop screen now showed a live tactical map, his position at the center of a digital spiderweb. Finally, he prepared his hide. He scraped out a shallow depression between the thick roots of an old-growth pine, creating a sniper's nest. It was just deep enough to conceal his silhouette. He layered it with fallen branches and pine boughs, then draped his camouflage netting over the top. The netting broke up his outline, making him a part of the forest floor. From this position, he could observe his screen and the valley below, remaining completely invisible. Night fell like a curtain, and the temperature plummeted. The forest, quiet by day, came alive with a symphony of nocturnal sounds. The hoot of a distant owl, the snap of a twig in the undergrowth, the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. Callahan sat motionless, wearing a set of active hearing protection earmuffs that amplified the faintest sounds while suppressing loud noises. His gaze was fixed on the laptop screen, where the map of his perimeter glowed with a grid of green, reassuring icons. The world was reduced to data points and heat signatures. At 2:17 a.m., a single icon on the screen flashed red. The outermost seismic sensor on the eastern perimeter had been tripped. A minute later, another sensor closer in also turned red. Something was moving, not running, walking, a heavy, rhythmic tread. Callahan switched the display to the feed from the corresponding infrared camera. The world resolved into a monochrome landscape of heat signatures. 5 bright white shapes emerged from the blackness of the trees. They were not moving like a scattered pack of animals. They were moving in formation, like a trained patrol. A point man, 2 on the flanks and 2 trailing behind. Their discipline was chilling. They paused at the edge of the destroyed camp, their movements fluid and confident. The largest of them, the Alpha he assumed, lifted its head, its movements eerily human-like. It scanned the clearing slowly, methodically. Then its head swiveled, its gaze sweeping across the dark hillside until it stopped, aimed directly at the ridge where Callahan lay hidden. It could not see him. It could not know he was there. But it sensed his presence. It let out a low, guttural clicking sound, a noise like dry bones striking together. Instantly, the other 4 turned and melted back into the trees, as silent as they had appeared. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, traced a line down Callahan's spine. This was not an animal investigation of a strange scent. This was a reconnaissance team, and they knew something was wrong. Callahan spent the next 24 hours in his nest, a statue of patient observation. He cycled through periods of high alert and low-power rest, never truly sleeping. He ate a cold meal, a dense protein bar that tasted like chalk, and drank water sparingly from his canteen. He analyzed. The brief appearance of the patrol had given him invaluable data. They were disciplined. They used signals. They were cautious. The pack returned the following night, but their behavior had changed. They were more cautious, circling the perimeter of the destroyed camp at a greater distance, probing the edges of his sensor network but never fully committing. he felt a surge of professional confidence. They were wary of him. His technology gave him the upper hand. The mission protocol was clear. He needed confirmation. That meant a body or, at the very least, a viable tissue sample. A photograph of a heat signature was not enough. Hughes did not pay for assumptions. He decided it was time to strike. His plan was simple: a textbook long-range engagement, a clinical application of force. He would eliminate a single target from his concealed position, retrieve the necessary sample under the cover of their confusion, and exfiltrate to his pickup point. It was clean, efficient, and well within his capabilities. He would reassert control over the situation, reminding them who the true apex predator was. The pack appeared again just after midnight, 5 heat signatures moving through the cold woods. They emerged from the east, moving with a slinking, hesitant gait. They were more hesitant now, avoiding the open ground of the camp and sticking to the tree line. Callahan waited, his breathing slow and even, his body perfectly still. He tracked them through the thermal scope, the world a canvas of black and white. His moment came when one of the smaller creatures broke from the group, moving toward the creek for a drink. It was a perfect, isolated target, separated from the main body by 30 yards of open space. The laser rangefinder in his scope gave him a reading, 270 yards. An easy shot. The ritual of the shot began. He settled into the rifle, his body becoming one with the machine. The stock was firm against his shoulder, his cheek welded to the riser. He began the 4-count cycle of box breathing. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold, slowing his heart rate to a steady, rhythmic beat. A slight breeze whispered through the pines. He made a 2-click adjustment for windage on his scope's turret. The crosshairs of the thermal optic settled on the center of the target's torso, a bright, stable point of heat. He exhaled slowly, and at the bottom of his breath, in the moment of perfect stillness where the world stopped, he squeezed the trigger. The suppressed report of the carbine was a dull, heavy cough, a sound of compressed air and violence, swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the forest. Down in the valley, the creature flinched violently. It let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek, a sound of agony so sharp and chilling it contained an unnerving echo of a human scream. It staggered, then crashed to its side, its long limbs thrashing, clawing futilely at the cold ground. The reaction from the rest of the pack was instantaneous and terrifyingly coordinated. There was no panic, no chaotic flight. The alpha let out a short, commanding bark. 2 of the creatures immediately rushed to their fallen comrade, seizing it by the scruff and forelimbs, and began dragging it with incredible speed back into the dense cover of the forest. The other 2, including the alpha, split off, bolting in the opposite direction. A classic tactical maneuver to draw fire and create a diversion. Watching through his thermal scope, Callahan made his first critical error, an oversight born from professional pride. He saw their reaction not as disciplined tactics, but as a panicked, fractured retreat. He had not secured a clean kill, only a disabling wound. That was a variable he had to correct. He could not lose the sample. Protocol was protocol. Confirmation was the mission. He decided not to wait for morning. The darkness was his ally. He moved fast, packing a light assault kit, leaving his main ruck, laptop, and heavy gear in the nest. He took the rifle, the pistol, 4 extra magazines, and his individual first aid kit. The confidence that he was in complete control that he was the predator dictating the terms of engagement, propelled him forward. He slid down the steep side of the ridge and picked up the bright, hot trail of blood in his thermal sight. The hunt was on. He did not realize who was hunting whom. For the first half hour, the pursuit felt deceptively easy. The blood trail was a series of stark, white splashes on the cold, dark ground when viewed through his thermal scope, each drop glowing like a tiny ember. The trail was easy to follow, even with only his tactical flashlight cutting a narrow, disciplined beam through the absolute darkness. Callahan moved with the swift, quiet economy of an experienced tracker, his boots making almost no sound on the damp leaf litter. His senses were on high alert, his head on a constant, slow swivel. He was certain the wounded creature and its two escorts were not far ahead. Their pace would be slowed by the dead weight of their injured companion. The logic was sound. The assumption was flawed. But as he pressed on, a full mile from his nest, he began to notice subtle oddities. The trail did not plunge straight into the thickest, most difficult terrain as a panicked animal's would. It did not crash through dense underbrush or lead him up steep, impassable slopes. Instead, it led him on a gentle, curving path, guiding him along game trails and through natural clearings. It was convenient. Callahan dismissed it as coincidence, the creatures instinctively taking the path of least resistance. He was the hunter. They were the prey. His mindset framed every piece of data. The character of the forest around him began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dense, interlocking ceiling that blotted out the faint starlight. The air grew colder, heavier, trapped beneath the canopy. A dry branch snapped sharply to his right. He froze, rifle up, sweeping the area with his thermal scope. The heat signature of a raccoon flickered and vanished. He relaxed, but a knot of tension remained. A few minutes later, another sound, this time from his left, a rustle in the bushes. He dismissed it as deer, startled by his passage. The adrenaline and the single-minded focus of the chase were dulling the finer edges of his situational awareness. He was focused on the trail ahead, not the darkness that was closing in around him. 2 hours passed, then 3. The wounded creature was displaying an impossible level of stamina. The blood trail was still fresh, but the distance he had covered was immense. Callahan felt the first tendrils of fatigue, the dull ache in his calves and lower back. The weight of his plate carrier and ammunition, once a comfort, now pressed down on his shoulders. The deep chill of the Michigan night was starting to seep into his bones. He paused for a moment behind a thicket of birch to drink from his canteen, a flicker of unease finally registering as he realized just how far he had come from the relative safety of his observation post. He was deep in their territory now, miles from his gear, his sensors, his plan. He found where the creatures had paused. A large, bright pool of blood stained the leaf litter, steaming faintly in the cold. But next to it, another set of tracks, larger than the others, had been laid down. The prints were fresh, pressed deeply into the soil. One of the escorts had circled back, its prints overlapping the trail, checking to see if they were still being followed. Callahan saw the evidence clearly, but his interpretation was skewed by his hunter's mindset. They were afraid. They were afraid he was closing in. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He was wearing them down. The terrain grew rockier, more rugged, the ground sloping downward. His wrist-mounted global positioning system, which had been his infallible guide in a dozen other operations, began to flicker, the signal struggling to penetrate the dense canopy and the rising canyon walls. He was now completely reliant on the blood trail, a trail that was leading him deeper and deeper into a narrow, winding ravine. And then he saw it. Up ahead, 100 yards away, was his quarry. The wounded creature was slumped against a large, dark boulder at the end of the ravine. He could see the faint puffs of its breath clouding in the cold air through his thermal scope. It appeared exhausted, defeated, alone. Callahan slowed his pace, his grip tightening on his rifle. The hunt was almost over. The ravine narrowed as he advanced, the rocky walls rising steeply on either side, funneling him forward. The ground was loose scree that crunched under his boots, the sounds echoing off the stone. It was a natural shooting gallery. The thought flickered through his mind. A perfect place for an ambush. But he pushed it aside. His training screamed that this was a fatal funnel, a tactical nightmare. But these were animals. They did not think in terms of complex, tactical geography. He had the target in his sights, an isolated, wounded creature. He was closing for the kill. The objective was yards away. He moved with deliberate slowness now, the hunter's patient stalk. He closed the distance. 50 yards, 40. The ravine walls were so close he could have reached out and touched both sides. 30. He raised the carbine, looking through the magnified thermal scope. The wounded creature lay still, its heat signature blooming brightly against the cold rock. Its only movement, a slight tremor that ran through its body. It had not moved. It had not looked up. It was waiting to die. Callahan's finger found the cold, curved steel of the trigger, taking up the slack. It was then that he heard the sound. It was not a growl or a howl. It was not a sound of nature. It was a quiet, sharp click, like two stones being struck together. The sound came from above him and to his rear. Every instinct, honed by a decade in hostage rescue and 100 live-fire exercises, screamed at him. That was a signal. It was a sound no animal made. Callahan froze. He did not look. He listened, his entire body rigid. The blood in his veins turned to ice. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle, letting it hang from its sling. He heard another click, this time from the ridge to his right, then a third from his left. These were not random noises. They were signals. Coordinated. Precise. They were marking his position. Ice water flooded his veins. His tactical confidence shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. He unclipped the high-intensity flashlight from his rifle and snapped the beam upwards, toward the top of the ravine wall. In the brilliant white light, 2 pairs of luminous, yellow-green eyes blinked back at him. They stared down not with feral rage, but with a calm, predatory intelligence. They were not surprised. He swung the beam to the opposite ridge. 2 more pairs of eyes met his, unblinking. 4 of them, on high ground. His heart hammered against his ribs like a piston. He spun around, his boots grinding on the gravelly floor of the ravine. There, at the entrance, blocking his only path of retreat, stood the Alpha. It was upright, standing on 2 legs, its massive 7-foot-tall silhouette framed perfectly against the slightly lighter night sky. It was as still as a granite statue, a sentinel guarding the gate to his tomb. He jerked his head back toward his wounded target. The creature slowly lifted its head. There was no agony in its eyes. There was no fear. There was only a cold, sentient, and all-consuming hatred. It had performed its role perfectly. It was the bait. It had led him here. In that horrifying moment of clarity, Callahan understood. He had not been hunting. He had been herded. Every step he had taken since leaving his nest had been on a path they had chosen for him. The convenient trail, the snapping twigs, the circling tracks, his tactical gear, his confidence, his training, they had used it all against him. He was not the predator. He was the prey, and the trap had just snapped shut. In a single, gut-wrenching second, Callahan's entire operational paradigm shattered. He was not in an animal's ambush. He was in a meticulously prepared tactical kill box, orchestrated by an enemy that understood military strategy. This was not instinct. This was intellect. They had baited the hook with a wounded pawn to lure the enemy's most dangerous piece, the sniper, out of his fortified position and into a compromised one. It was a classic gambit from a manual on insurgent tactics. His mind, now running on pure, high-octane adrenaline, began to deconstruct the trap with a horrifying new lucidity. They had not just herded him into a ravine. They had chosen a location with steep, high walls that would degrade radio signals, a natural Faraday cage. They had observed his tactics from the previous night, noting his solitary, relentless pursuit. They had exploited his professional arrogance, correctly predicting he would go after the wounded target to confirm the kill, to follow his protocol. They did not just know he was there. They knew how he thought. He looked into the unblinking eyes of the alpha at the end of the ravine. Its posture was not that of a beast. It was a commander observing a captured enemy. This was not just a hunt for food or a defense of territory. This was retribution. This was a calculated, cold, and intelligent response to his attack. They were not just eliminating a threat. They were delivering a sentence. They were making an example of him. He had shot one of them, and now they would dismantle him, piece by piece. He finally grasped their true tactical advantage. It was not just their speed or strength, their claws or teeth. It was their perfect, innate mastery of the terrain, combined with a patient, predatory intelligence. They were faster, stronger, and their senses were tools of warfare he could not begin to comprehend. They communicated with silent clicks and subtle shifts in posture, a battlefield language he could not crack. In this stone maze, his technology was worthless. His thermal scope could not see through 100 feet of solid rock, and his seismic sensors were miles away, guarding an empty camp and an abandoned laptop. He was deaf and blind. The strange details of the chase replayed in his mind with horrifying new clarity. The convenient path that avoided heavy undergrowth was not for their benefit. It was for his, to keep him moving quickly, to keep him from stopping to think. The snapping twigs to his left and right were not random sounds. They were shepherds, flanking him, keeping him on the designated path, driving him like livestock into the abattoir. The whole chase was a lie. He realized that every agency file, every fragmented report from past incidents, had been catastrophically wrong. They had all focused on the creature's physical capabilities, their claws, their teeth, their strength, the butcher's bill. But the true danger, the real weapon, was their intelligence. A cunning, practical, and utterly ruthless intelligence honed over centuries, or perhaps millennia, of hunting and surviving in the shadows of human civilization. Callahan took a half-step back, his shoulders pressing against the cold, unyielding rock of the ravine wall. The thrill of the hunt had evaporated, replaced by the icy calculation of a professional who has been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. He was no longer an agent on a mission. He was a man fighting for his life against something that no briefing, no training, and no protocol had ever prepared him for. His first instinct was a conditioned reflex, a desperate muscle memory from 1,000 training scenarios. Call for support. Callahan ripped the satellite encryptor from his shoulder strap. The scheduled communication window was hours away, but he fumbled with the buttons, his gloved fingers suddenly clumsy, trying to activate the emergency distress beacon. The indicator light blinked a weak green, then red, then died. No signal. The high stone walls of the ravine were doing their job, blanketing him in a shroud of electronic silence. They had chosen this place for its isolation. He was completely, irrevocably alone. The system could not reach him here. The creatures did not attack. They began to play with him. One of the figures on the ridge above started to deliberately scrape its claws against the rock. The high-pitched, grating sound echoed down the narrow canyon, a nail-on-chalkboard torture designed to fray his nerves to make him crack. Another began to emit a low, guttural growl, a frequency so deep he felt it as a vibration in his chest more than he heard it with his ears. It was a psychological assault, a methodical dismantling of his composure. They began to move, their dark forms shifting along the rim of the ravine like ghosts. They never presented a clear target, just a flicker of motion here, a silhouette there, always half concealed by rock and shadow. They were forcing him to turn his head, to divide his attention, to burn mental and physical energy tracking threats that were not attacking. It was a test. One of them intentionally nudged a small rock over the edge. It clattered down near his feet. Callahan instinctively flinched, his rifle coming up, the holographic sight painting an empty patch of gravel. They were studying his reaction time, his aiming cycle, his readiness. They were gathering data. He pressed his back harder against the rock, forcing his breathing to slow, taking a frantic mental inventory of his assets. 2 partially spent magazines for the carbine. 34 rounds left. 3 full ones for the Glock. 45 rounds. 1 combat knife. 1 combat application tourniquet on his plate carrier. 1 syringe of morphine. A sickening realization washed over him. He did not have enough ammunition to fight his way out. There were at least 5 of them that he had seen. Every shot had to be a kill, and even then, it would not be enough. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and surrounded. The foundations of his training crumbled. Hostage rescue tactics, close quarters battle drills, counter-terrorism protocols, all useless. They were designed for fighting humans in human environments. His enemy did not use cover. It was part of the landscape. It did not follow human patterns of engagement. Callahan understood his fundamental error. He had tried to apply his rules to their game. He had brought a chessboard to a knife fight in the dark. In the oppressive, ringing silence between the scraping sounds, the memory of Idaho returned, sharp and clear. He had followed protocol then, too, a rigid adherence to a plan that failed to account for a critical variable. An armed suspect in an unexpected location. And an innocent person, a hostage, had died. Now, here he was again, trapped by his own methodical confidence, a prisoner of the very system that was supposed to ensure his success. The irony was a bitter pill. He was not going to be killed by a mistake, but by his greatest professional strength, his unwavering adherence to the plan. He knew a defensive standoff was just a slow, drawn-out execution. His only chance, however slim, was to attack. To create chaos. A desperate, violent push to break their containment. He scanned the ring of silent watchers and picked his vector. The spot on the ridge with only a single figure. It was the weakest point in their cordon. He prepared himself for one last, desperate rush. To die on his feet, not on his knees. Taking a deep, ragged breath that scraped his lungs, Callahan exploded into motion. It was not a charge of courage, but of pure, distilled desperation. He lunged toward the entrance of the ravine, firing a short, controlled burst from the carbine toward the Alpha. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. It was not a killing shot. It was suppressive fire, meant to make the big one flinch, to buy him a half-second of hesitation. But they were ready. They had anticipated it. As if on a silent command, the two creatures who had been flanking him on the ridges leaped from their perches. A drop of only 10 or 12 feet, landing on the ravine floor directly in his path with an unnerving, silent agility. The first one lunged. It was a blur of dark fur and muscle. Callahan met the charge with a point-blank shot to its chest. The heavy rifle round slammed into the creature with the force of a sledgehammer, throwing it backward against the rock wall with a wet, heavy thud. But the second one was on him in the same instant. It did not try to bite or grapple. It swung a massive forelimb, claws extended like steel hooks. The blow connected with his left thigh. A searing, blinding pain erupted as the claws tore through his combat pants and deep into muscle and bone. He screamed, a raw, involuntary sound of shock and agony, and went down hard, his rifle skittering away on the gravel. The pain was a clarifying agent, a white-hot flash that cut through his fear. He rolled, ignoring the fire in his leg, and his hand found the familiar, textured grip of the Glock on his hip. The second creature was turning for another strike, its maw open, revealing rows of yellowed, dagger-like teeth. Callahan fired twice. The powerful pistol slug struck the creature's torso, and it crumpled with a wet, gurgling sound, collapsing in a heap just feet from him. Before he could even process the small, bloody victory, another shadow blurred past him. It was not an attack. It was a precise, calculated maneuver. A third creature, moving with incredible speed, scooped up his fallen carbine and with a powerful flick of its head flung the rifle a dozen yards away. It clattered against the far wall of the ravine and disappeared into a deep, dark crevice. They had disarmed him of his primary weapon. They had learned from the first shot. And then they pulled back. Again. The Alpha remained at the entrance, impassive. The watchers on the ridge were still. They left him there, alone with his two dead, his bleeding leg, and his pistol. They were not rushing in for a chaotic kill where he might take another of them with him in a final blaze of glory. They were reverting to their previous tactic. They were waiting. They understood that a wounded, bleeding enemy is a weakening enemy. They did not need to take the risk. They would let his own biology, the shock and the blood loss, do the work for them. Fighting waves of nausea and dizziness, Callahan grabbed the tourniquet from his vest. With trembling, blood-slicked hands, he cinched it high and tight on his thigh, twisting the windlass until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. The immediate pain from the pressure was immense, a crushing vice on his shattered muscle, but it was a necessary agony. He knew what they were doing now. They were treating him like a pack of wolves treats a cornered moose, bleeding it, exhausting it, waiting for it to collapse from its own injuries. They were teaching him a lesson in patience and cruelty. He dragged himself backward until his back was against the cold stone wall. He sat there, his useless leg stretched out in front of him, the Glock held tightly in a white-knuckled grip. He looked at the dark, patient silhouettes that had once again taken up their positions on the ridges. He thought of the cover story Hughes had prepared for him. His death would be a neat, tidy entry in a file, another secret absorbed by the code of silence. He would simply be gone. An hour passed, or maybe it was a lifetime. Time had lost its meaning, measured now only in the throbbing of his leg and the deepening of the cold. The cold was a physical thing now, a predator in its own right, seeping deep into his bones, making his muscles stiff and his thoughts sluggish. His wounded leg was a block of numb, throbbing agony below the tourniquet, a dead weight he was tethered to. He fought to stay conscious, to resist the seductive pull of shock-induced sleep, biting his own lip until he tasted the salt of his blood. The creatures remained silent on the ridges, their motionless presence a far greater pressure than any threat or howl. It was the pressure of inevitability. The flashlight he had set on a nearby rock began to flicker. The battery was dying. The beam weakened, pulsed a sickly yellow, and then weakened again, casting long, dancing shadows that made the ravine seem to press in on him. The encroaching darkness felt like a signal, their signal, the end of the intermission. His hand, clumsy with cold, fumbled in his pocket and found the small, waterproof container. Inside was a Zippo lighter and a single crushed cigarette. It was his end-of-game ritual, a small personal ceremony he never believed he would perform. With a thumb that barely seemed to belong to him, he sparked the lighter. The small flame illuminated his face for a moment, a mask of dirt, dried blood, and grim resolve. He lit the cigarette, the flare of the tip, a tiny star of defiance in the oppressive dark. He took a long, slow drag, the smoke burning his raw throat. It tasted like freedom. The Alpha, still standing guard at the mouth of the ravine, saw the flicker of light. Its head tilted slightly. It perceived it not as a sign of weakness, but as a final act of insolence, an uncooperative piece of meat refusing to die quietly. It let out a short, sharp, guttural bark. It was not a howl of challenge. It was a command, an order to finish it. In that instant, the shadows on the ridges broke loose. They did not charge in a chaotic wave. They attacked from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm his ability to focus on a single threat. 2 from the ridges, leaping down, and the Alpha, finally moving from its post. Callahan raised the Glock. His movements were slow, burdened by pain and cold, but not panicked. There was no panic left, only procedure. Each shot was deliberate. The first muzzle flash lit up a snarling face mid-leap. The second. One of the attackers tumbled forward and lay still. The third shot. The fourth. A click. The slide on the pistol locked back on an empty chamber. He had miscounted in the dark, his mind fractured by pain and cold. He let the useless pistol fall from his numb fingers. He did not scream. He did not beg. As the Alpha rushed forward to deliver the final blow, its massive form blotting out the last of the starlight, Callahan looked up into its intelligent, merciless eyes. There was no fear in his gaze now, only a cold, contemptuous fury. The fury of a man refusing to be a mere statistic, a victim to be quietly erased. He gripped his combat knife, its blade a final, tiny glint of steel in the dying light of his flashlight. It was his last gesture of defiance against the system, against nature, against death itself. He would make them earn it. The final moment was not seen by any human eye, but heard. A furious, triumphant roar from the Alpha, a sound that was both bestial and intelligent, a declaration of victory. The sound of a brief, violent struggle, of tearing fabric and flesh, the sickening crunch of bone. It was punctuated by a single short human cry, quickly choked off and swallowed by the primeval chaos. And then, silence. A profound and absolute silence that settled over the ravine, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. The darkness reclaimed the kill box, leaving nothing behind but the scent of blood on the cold night air. 2 weeks later, a different vehicle navigated the same overgrown logging trail. It was a heavily modified four-wheel drive truck, its suspension built for punishment, its paint a flat, non-reflective gray. 2 men emerged. They were dressed in similar tactical gear to Callahan, but their equipment was newer, their movements more fluid and practiced. They moved as a pair, a seamless unit, their faces devoid of all expression. They were not investigators. They were not rescuers. They were the next component in the system. The cleanup crew. The erasers. They found the site of the last stand with practiced ease, following a beacon that had been sewn into Callahan's gear, a dead man's switch that activated after 72 hours of no movement. They cataloged the scene with cold, detached efficiency. They photographed the area from multiple angles. They found the heavy-caliber pistol casings ejected in a neat arc. They found the discarded pistol with its empty magazine, slide locked back. They recovered the broken carbine from the crevice in the rock. They found patches of dried blood on the gravel that genetic analysis later confirmed belonged to Callahan. They also found traces of non-human blood and 2 distinct sets of drag marks leading away from the ravine. They did not find a body. Not a shred of clothing, not a single bone. The area had been picked clean with a terrifying thoroughness. The encrypted report sent to Hughes was concise and clinical. Asset confirmed lost in action. Threat validated. Estimated enemy losses. 2 hostiles confirmed by on-site evidence. Asset neutralized an equal number before being overwhelmed. Recommend reclassification of threat to level 5. Subject demonstrates adaptive tactics, tool denial, and learning capability. Containment protocol advised, not elimination. Engagement is too costly. The official report, filed with the National Park Service, was equally concise. Contract biologist Ryan Callahan is presumed to have fallen from a cliff during a period of sudden, severe weather while tracking wildlife. Body likely carried away by river currents or scavenged. Search efforts have been suspended due to hazardous terrain. The code of silence was upheld. The file was closed, stamped deceased, and archived in a vault deep beneath the earth. The forest kept its secrets, and deep within its shadows, an ancient, intelligent predator now knew with certainty how its enemies hunted, the weapons they carried, and the tactics they used. And it had learned. It was waiting.